Hey, what's up guys? I hope you've been having a good day and a good week. So it was pretty clear from the last question I asked that most of you wanted 5 stories per video. However, there were a few of you who wanted 15 to 20 stories per video, so I think I'd come up with a compromise. Obviously, I can't make videos that are that large and still produce 2 videos to 3 videos a week. So as a compromise, I think I'm going to keep on producing the 2 to 3 videos a week that are only 5 stories in length, and then perhaps every week or every 2 weeks, I'll compile all those stories into one video, so the people who simply want to listen to the stories all in one go without listening to a bunch of introductions and etc. can listen to those videos. So tell me what you guys think. Would you guys like to see those videos with 20 stories plus? So let me know what you think down in the comments. The following 5 stories are true to the best of my knowledge and can be found on the subreddit Let's Not Meet. If you like the following stories, please make sure to leave a like, a comment, or subscribe, especially if you'd like to keep updated with the channel. Without further delay, here are 5 true creepy stories. Number 1. Around 11 years ago, when I was 18, I left school and moved to the big bright lights of London to start my gap year and discover myself. I didn't know a lot of people as I was naive, young, and totally unstreetwise. One night, I had a few drinks with one of my few friends, and then I headed home. Hailed a black cab and gave the driver directions to my family friend's house I was staying in. The black cab driver must have immediately sensed that I wasn't in a great mood and started asking me about myself and what I was doing in London. I had had a fair bit to drink, so I remember telling him that I was new to London and lonely, that the city was hard, the typical stupid 18-year-old stuff. We pulled into the residential street I was staying on, which was very quiet and dark. The cab driver pulled up a few doors from where I was staying, and I suddenly didn't relish the idea of creeping into a dark house to just go to bed. I was 18 and full of energy, so when the cab driver asked if I wanted to drink, I jumped at the chance. Then, things started to get weird. The cab driver turned off the engine of the car, and the street was suddenly very quiet. He opened his car door, got out, opened mine, stepped in, pulled the seat down, and sat directly opposite me. At this point, some alarm bells started ringing. This was such a strange and creepy violation that I was suddenly very aware of my surroundings. Having gone from talking to the back of someone's head with a partition between you, so suddenly sitting face to face with that person with about 20 centimeters between our knees was very odd. But hey, I was 18, bored, and I really wanted a drink. I may add that I went on to have a pretty serious alcohol addiction over the next few years, checked into rehab, and am now sober. But this is a very good example of the kinds of dangerous situations I would put myself into to obtain a drink. The memory from then onwards is hazy. But Steve, now I know this is a fake name, had some homemade champagne, and we sat and drank for a few hours. He was nice to begin with, and even though I knew that this was a weird situation, wanting a drink was a more powerful emotion than my safety. But as I got drunker, I do remember the conversation becoming more and more uncomfortable. I was very aware that I was stuck in a confided space with a strange man, and that he knew where I lived. Even my stupid 18-year-old self knew that I could be in trouble if I wasn't careful, and this culminated in him saying that he was a virgin and that he wanted and that he knew I was the one, and that his first time should be with me. At some point during the conversation, I had said that I was struggling for money, so he then offered me £200 to have sex with him. I felt extremely sick and violated, and needed to get out of there. Steve was not pleased and wanted me to stay, verging on the aggressive, insisting that I take his number if I changed my mind. The next morning, I woke up with a horrendous hangover and a terrible sense of guilt. I burnt the piece of paper that Steve had given me and swore never to put myself in such a compromising position again. For months, I was wary of black cab drivers outside my house, and I never told anyone what had happened. I was sick with shame. Fast forward 6 years, I was working as a junior at a woman's magazine in the center of London. On my way in to work, I grab my usual copy of the Metro newspaper, take a sip of my coffee, glance at the front page, and freeze. There, staring back at me, is a mugshot of Steve, and the headline, Black Cab Rapist. The face in my memory was now on the front page of every paper in the land, and they were calling him one of the most prolific sex offenders in British criminal history. When I got to work, I called the police, and that afternoon, I went to the police station to give my statement. It was the first time I had told anyone about that night, and whilst there was a huge sense of relief, there was also so much guilt that I hadn't reported him sooner. Despite the fact that he had not touched me, the police think that I may have been one of the first victims he tried to ply with spiked champagne, but that he had not put enough drugs in it to work. Steve's real name is John Warboys, and is now serving 8 years for attacking, drugging, and raping over 100 women on the streets of London. Number 2. The following account occurred roughly 3 years ago during the summer of 2012. It has always been difficult for me to talk about it, but I have found writing about it to be therapeutic. I was 17 at the time, and I had just gotten my first job. I lived in rural Western Virginia in a small mountain community. My mom's friend owned a camping resort not far from my house that had a general store, and she said she'd pay me to help out in the store during the busy months. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community could get so isolated because most of us lived pretty far away from each other. One day, a big burly mountain man type came into the store. He was in his late 40s, early 50s, probably 6'5" and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty, like he worked outside a lot. His clothes were sort of tattered and he had a long beard. We had a few of the woodsy hermit types in the area, and he definitely looked like one of them. He bought some basic items, one of which was one of our homemade bars of soap. When he came to the register, he looked me up and down carefully. He didn't talk for a minute, just stared. His people skills clearly needed work. "Did you make this soap?" he asked gruffly. "Possibly," I said. "I help out with that sometimes." "You make a lot of your own stuff?" he asked. "Toiletries and things like that." "Yeah," I responded. "I like that," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly did not know how to respond. I quickly rang up his items, and he paid with crumpled money. Right before he left, he asked, "You cook too?" "Sometimes," I replied. "Bet the boys round here itching to marry you," he said, as he smiled to himself. I said nothing. I was puzzled as to what I had said that stood out as wife material. I told Krista, my mom's friend and boss, about the bizarre encounter, and she laughed it off. So did my family and friends. But then, Mountain Man started turning up more often. We chatted a little, here and there, and I found out that he had a cabin in the woods. He claimed he built it with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off the land. Other than that, he also lived off the things that he bought at the store. Over time, our chatter escalated, with him making comments about how nice it would be to have a woman like me around who could make those things and cook his kills. One time, he even said I had the burthen hips that men lust after. He even started inviting me to fish with him, hunt with him, see his place, etc., and I always politely declined. But he kept on getting more and more insistent, and I told Krista about how uncomfortable he was starting to make me feel. The intensity with which he said those things really scared me. She said that when he came in, go get her and that she would ring him up. Thanks to her, I started speaking less to him, and I thought I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But one night, I was closing up, and it was late, around 10 at night. Krista had left about an hour before, and I was leaving by myself. The only two cars in front of the store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed, because I knew that Mountain Man drove a blue pickup. I didn't see him in the lot, just his car, so I quickly walked to my car and checked the back seat before I started her up. But then, when I first turned the key into the ignition, I got nothing but sputters. I tried several more times and got scared quickly. Of all nights, why is this happening tonight? I remember asking myself angrily. Just as I was reaching out for my phone to call for help, there was a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I'm shocked that I didn't piss myself. I didn't even want to look, because I knew it was him. But I did, and my suspicions were confirmed. He smiled a big grin at me, showing me exactly which teeth were missing. "Need some help?" he asked loudly through the window. I quickly shook my head furiously and said, "My dad is on his way," hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoken to my dad in years, actually. Mountain Man laughed. "No, he's not," he said. "Open the door." The hairs on my neck stood up straight. How did he know I was bluffing? "No," I said firmly. "Now leave me alone." Suddenly, he looked angry. He pulled at the handle, but I had locked all the doors when I first got in. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. "Leave now, or I'm calling the cops," I screamed at him. He clearly wasn't getting the message, so I pulled out my phone and called 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher, and I knew that she could hear him pounding. She said she would have an officer out ASAP, but out here, that could be a while. "The cops are now on their way. Leave now," I screamed at Mountain Man, who didn't seem to let it deter him. But after a few more minutes of pounding, he suddenly stopped and walked back to his truck. I watched him go, hopeful he would leave me alone. But then, he started walking back towards me with a freaking crowbar in hand. "No," I screamed at him. "Get away from me." He started swinging at the driver's window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat on the floor and covered the back of my neck like they teach you in tornado drills. I heard the sickening crack of the window, but not for long. Suddenly, I heard a male voice shouting, telling Mountain Man to get away from the car. I sat up and saw two men approaching, one with a shotgun pointed at the Mountain Man. I recognized them as a couple of guests staying at the resort for a camping trip. I breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car, telling them that the police were on their way. I thanked them profusely, and as we waited for the police, surprisingly, Mountain Man didn't make any moves to get away. But the cops came pretty quickly after that, so he didn't have much of a chance. They took him away and I gave them my statement. I was pretty shaken up a while afterwards. A few weeks later, I finally got the scoop on the man. Apparently, he had a history of mental illness. He had been in and out of state institutions. He really had been living in an old cabin in the woods where he wasn't taking his meds and his issues were only getting worse. My cousin, Luke, is a cop, and later on he told me some more about the case that he had heard about through some other officers. The police did a search of the cabin after the incident to see if there was anything that might be of interest to them. They found a journal that Mountain Man kept. Apparently, in it he said that he was lonely and wanted a wife. He mentioned me by name a lot, and Luke said that there were a lot of lewd things in there about me that he didn't want to share, but he tried to put it simply by saying that Mountain Man had a detailed plan to abduct me, starting with sabotaging my car engine to get me in a vulnerable position. When Luke said that, I nearly burst into tears thinking about how horribly that night could have gone if those two men hadn't come along. Thankfully, he has been put back into a state institution. With any luck, he'll stay there for good. Number 3. Okay, so to start off with a little background info. I'm a 19-year-old female attending community college in Oregon. So back in February, I was paired with this guy named Brian for my chemistry lab. He was significantly older than the rest of the students, probably in his early 40s. He was very tall, I'm guessing like 6'4", and just a big guy in general. Kinda chubby, but also had a lot of muscle. I was friendly to this guy, even though he creeped me out a bit. If he found out we had an interest in common, he would not stop talking about it. When lab ended, I'd have lunch in the cafeteria. He would walk with me and just go on and on about things we had in common, and then invite himself to lunch with me. I wasn't creeped out by this at all. It just felt like he didn't understand social things that well. Once I tried to get rid of him by telling him I had to go to the bathroom, and he just waited for me the whole time. He would pop up everywhere, literally. Anywhere I was on campus, he'd show up, even on the days he didn't have any classes. He'd also text me non-stop. I had to give him my phone number once so that we could send notes to each other that we had missed. At this point, I still wasn't creeped out. I just thought he wanted a friend. But things got worse. He started to get flirty with me at first. He'd call me beautiful and ask if I had a boyfriend and touch me a lot, like touching my arm or my waist, nothing too serious. He also used to come up behind me and massage me. He also joked that I looked like 15 all the time. Once he said, "You're young enough to be my hot daughter." After this, he amped up his creepy level. When I'd get upset, he'd always be like, "I was kidding, you prude." Around this time, he also started showing up at my work. I never told him where I worked. He pretended to not know where I worked the first time, and then after that, he'd say that he was stopping by because he was in the area or buying something. One day, when I was on the computer at my school's library, and he showed up and sat at the computer across from me. My computer had just run out of time, because you only get an hour of free computer use a day, and he told me that he had to go so I could use his. I went on his computer, and me, being stupid and curious, checked the history since he was just on it. After a little bit of snooping, I found what was obviously his Tumblr. Same name and a bio matched the description. He only had a couple hundred posts and reboots total. Most of his reblogs were NSFW posts of really young looking girls. But that wasn't the most disturbing thing. He had written tons of posts about me. His early posts were nonsense angry rants, but on the exact day of our first lab together, he wrote a detailed account of our interaction when we first met. He described me as a vulnerable young girl and usually too old for his liking, but that I looked young. My stomach churned when I read this. The post went on, describing more of our interactions. Him imagining having sex with me, imagining me pleasuring myself, describing how I reacted to his sexual remarks, him stalking my social media and pleasuring himself to my photos, and supposedly finding out where I worked, from Facebook. I immediately went home and called the police, but they said that there wasn't anything they could do unless he physically put me in danger. I couldn't sleep for a whole week after this. I notified my professor, and he switched my lab day. I changed my normal schedule around and spent the least amount of time on campus as possible. I bumped into him a few times, but I'd just tell him I had to go and hurry away. About a month later, as my roommate was unlocking the door late at night, a man grabbed her from behind. And luckily, she's a badass, muscly chick, and she has taken self-defense classes before. So she stomped on his foot, kicked him in the groin, and he runs like hell. When this all went down, I was inside the house, because I called in sick to work that day. She called the police, and they found a backpack with a rope, a knife, and tape right by our door. So at this point, I'm freaking out, and I tell the cops about Brian. I pull up his Tumblr page to show them, and sure enough, there was a new post. It was a long-ass post about how I'd been avoiding him, and that he thought I found myself a boyfriend, and that he was going to confront me tonight, and that we were going to run away together because I truly loved him. It was probably the most spine-chilling thing I've ever read. Long story short, they arrested him, found child porn on his computer as well, so he's soon to be in prison. What I wonder to this day is, what if I didn't call in sick to work that day? What if he had grabbed me instead? Would I still be alive? Would I end up dead in his trunk? Either way, Brian was my worst lab partner ever. Number 4. This happened 4 years ago. I was an 18-year-old girl at the time. I was on my way home from work after a long Saturday at about 4 a.m. I had worked 2 jobs for a total of 19 hours, so I was tired as hell, almost falling asleep, and it probably looked like I was super drunk. I was sitting on the train, trying to ignore all the drunk people, when I noticed 2 men staring at me, and talking to each other while pointing. I had a gut feeling that this wasn't right, and started thinking about how I was all alone, and probably looked like the most vulnerable person there. So I started thinking through my options, and remembered that my roommates had called earlier that evening to ask if I wanted to join in a Lord of the Rings marathon. It had been no more than 5 hours, so I was confident that they were still awake. So when my stop came up, I went to the front of the train so that I had a full overview of everyone leaving. I took my sweet time lighting a cigarette and watched everyone cross the rails, including the 2 men. They were still staring at me the entire time, but I was hoping I was just being paranoid and that they were going to keep going their way. I lived in the opposite direction, and so I started walking towards my home, getting my phone ready for a call, just in case. After about 20 meters, I looked back, and to my horror, I saw the two men had changed their directions and had started following me. I called my roommate, and after 2 rings, she picked up with a sleepy voice, and I asked if they could meet me. She was in a haze, saying, "Meet you? What?" And I still didn't want to say out loud that I was being followed, because I thought, what if I offended anyone? Suddenly, she sounded more aware and asked if anyone was following me. I turned around and they were 3 meters behind me. I yelled yes and started running for my life. This is when I learned how awesome adrenaline is at saving your ass. I ran over a bridge and started crossing a soccer field when I saw my roommate running towards me. Suddenly, I was in someone's arms crying when one of the guys ran back towards the way I came. We waited for him to come back, and he said that he had seen them on the other side of the bridge, looking angry and shouting at each other. And when we came back to the house, they explained that when I called, my roommate had been sleeping, but her boyfriend was awake, and as soon as she said, "Meet you," he understood what was going on and started to get dressed. And it's not an ending if I didn't find out what was supposed to happen to me. About a year later, I read the news story about the trial of 2 men who had kidnapped a girl and raped her for 2 days before letting her go. This happened the weekend after my encounter, and in the same apartment complex across from the street. Perhaps those men were the 2 who had been creepily following me that day. I'm glad I will never know. Number 5. A little backstory. I'm a 20-year-old short, petite female working at Subway, and I can't help but be nice to anyone, even if they creep me out. I usually feel bad, so that must be why. About a year ago, we had this guy that was 35 to 40 years old who would come in every day for lunch. He was fascinated by my stretched ears and a few piercings I had on my face, and always asked questions. He would sit down after I rang him out and watch me from his table for 2 hours non-stop, just staring at me while I helped other customers. This went on for about 2 weeks. Every day he would ask for my number, saying he had plugs and tunnels he wanted to give me and see me wearing them in my ears. I always politely declined, of course. One day, I was alone in the store because my manager had to run to the bank. We were having really slow business that day, so I was just in the back room messing around on my phone. I heard the door chime, looked up, and yet no one was there. Then I saw the man walk past the front door of the store really quickly, like he was in a hurry. The store phone then rang. I said, "Thanks for calling Subway, how can I help you?" "Is this the girl with the nice ears, right?" he asked. Yes, who is this?" I responded. He asked, "Are you alone in the back room right now? Are you working by yourself?" At this point, I got really creeped out, and I knew that it was him. I hung up and texted my manager the situation so that she would hurry back. He called again, this time asking me very weird questions, like what I would do to him in a room with the doors locked, if I had a boyfriend, why was I playing hard to get, etc. My manager gets back and I tell her everything. In the middle of the lunch rush, he calls again. This time, my manager answers, and to this day, she never told me what he said, but the look on her face made my spine shiver. She told him that if he called again or showed up here, she would call the police. I thought that was the end of it, but alas, I was wrong. 1 week later, I was clocking out and getting ready to walk to my car that was parked in the front, and then I looked outside, and I saw him standing by my car and looking inside of it. I was an idiot and left the trunk unlocked. I watched him crawl inside and shut the trunk. The creep was trying to hide in my trunk and do God knows what to me when I got in or out of the vehicle. My manager locked the front door of our store and called the police. When they arrived, they had to pretty much drag him out of my car and he was arrested. On him was a butcher knife, rope, and a rag with chloroform on it. If I hadn't looked up when I did, I would probably be dead right now. If you enjoyed the previous stories and would like to hear more similar creepy stories, then 2 of my previous videos are linked to in the description and can also be seen by clicking the annotations on the screen. If you like the video, please show your support by subscribing, liking, sharing, and commenting on the video. Additionally, if you'd like to hear more of my stories, please feel free to subscribe so that you will be notified of any new videos I post. Thanks for watching, and stay safe.